Hey guys, welcome to Module 3. You'll see that I have this PowerPoint loaded for you to listen to, and then also there's a separate file that just includes the PowerPoint only. I believe it's going to be pretty important for you to listen to this. I'm going to give you some clues on how to differentiate between what you're reading, the different types of vocabulary words, and how they're different. All right, so what we're using in this particular chapter, and remember I said we're going to pick back up at page 34, 35 at licensure, regulation, and accreditation. It's an alphabet soup. They all mean something very similar, but you're going to need to know the difference. And I'll break down the differences between these different terms over the next couple of slides. All right, so we're going to start with credential. And a credential, as it says here, is an umbrella term. And when I say umbrella term, you might want to think main term. As your book says too, and like we talk about, it's used for many types of programs, such as licensure, which we really haven't talked about yet, but we're going to get there, certification, accreditation, and certificates. A credential means that there is another body that's attesting to a qualification or a competence that is being issued to an individual. Take your RHIT credentials, for example. You learned in the last module that AHIMA will allow you to sit for the RHIT exam upon graduation from this program. And so that credential is an attestation of your qualifications of an entry-level registered health information technician. So when you think credential, I want you to think about those different types of abbreviations or letters that people have behind their names. CMA, MD, RN. Those are all credentials that have been issued by a third party to tell a potential employer, hey, this person is competent in the field that they've chosen, and I can tell they're competent based on the credentials that they have behind their name. Credentialing is a verb. Credential is a noun, but credentialing is a process, so it's a verb. We've talked a little bit about physician credentialing. That's how doctors are eligible to apply for services at your particular facility. It's a process within the facility that once the physician is credentialed, then they're eligible to admit and treat patients in your facility. Licensure, let's take a look at the first bullet. A process by which a governmental agency grants time-limited permission to an individual to engage in a given occupation after verifying that he or she has met predetermined and standardized criteria. All right, so you ready? So doctors and nurses are licensed to work in the states that they are deciding they want to work in. So if you are a nurse in the state of North Carolina, you have to pass your licensure exam in the state of North Carolina to be able to practice here. And so at the last sentence, in some cases, the term licensure and registration are used interchangeably. And RN stands for registered nurse, and that means registered with the state. A governmental agency within the state gives time-limited permission. Your nail technician, if you get your nails done, your cosmetologist, the person that cuts your hair, all of those folks are licensed to practice within the state of North Carolina. The second bullet says, but licensure can also be a process by which a governmental agency grants a facility to operate. So it's two totally different things depending upon how you're using it. We can licensure an individual, but we can also license a facility. And so the state of North Carolina has to license facilities for them to be able to operate in the state of North Carolina. Without that licensure, they close their doors or they're unable to open if they can't pass the criteria that's required by the state. And so that second sentence says, to remain operational, the facility must meet minimum standards and comply with state laws and regulations. That's partly what we're going to be doing in this particular module. We're going to take a look at the state requirements, but on a much smaller scale than licensing an entire hospital, obviously. Once we get to that part, you'll see what I'm talking about. I've picked out things that are going to be relevant for you to know that is applicable to licensure of a facility within the state of North Carolina. So licensure of an individual, again, we've talked about this. It ensures that they have a minimal degree of competency to perform the task. To become licensed, you have to meet eligibility requirements. For example, the RNs at the associate degree level must pass their courses and graduate from their particular college. And hey, guess what? An RN at an associate's degree and a bachelor's degree take the same test so they can be licensed within the state. There are ongoing requirements that need to be met to maintain, such as CEUs, which stands for Continuing Education Units. We talked a little bit about that last module when we talked about RHIT exams. It's important to note the last bullet, professional associations do not grant licensure. So you are not a licensed RHIT. The RHIT is given to you by a national professional association. So it's incorrect to say, I've got my license, I'm an RHIT. We're going to refer to that as a credential. Here's an example of where we're going to find the information. You can click on that link and it's going to take you to the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services to talk about how to establish a licensed facility within the state of North Carolina. We're going to go into depth later on in the module about that, but I want you to take a look at it so you know what the state medical facilities plan is and to visit the site where it talks about being licensed. These last two bullets are going to be very important for you to understand the difference of. NCGS means North Carolina General Statutes, and that's just big and fancy for the law. When your legislators go to Raleigh and work on behalf of us and make laws, they go into the North Carolina General Statutes. And that's where we learn how we're supposed to do things correctly in the state of North Carolina. From that, from the law, administrative code is developed. So that is what the NCAC is. We'll spend a little bit more time on the NCGS and NCAC once we're to that point in the module. But go ahead and familiarize yourself with those terms and those abbreviations so when I use them, you're not like, oh my gosh, what is NCGS? All right, certification we talked about, a voluntary process by which a non-governmental agency grants a time-limited recognition to an individual after verifying that he or she has met predetermined standardized criteria. So it can be to an individual, like it says here in the first bullet, or it can also be for facilities. Now, when we're talking about joint commissions in this module, we're mostly talking about the accreditation process, which is a much more involved process for your entire facility. But for example, a facility may decide to be certified in a particular area. Maybe they want to be known as a stroke center. So they're going to seek certification in their facility to be known across their region for stroke rehabilitation. Accreditation. The key word here, y'all, is voluntary. A voluntary process by which a non-governmental entity grants limited time recognition or credentials to an organization after verifying that predetermined and standardized criteria are met. Voluntary. You need to know that this is voluntary. Licensure that we talked about back here under facility is mandatory. You cannot operate a facility in the state of North Carolina without a license. But this accreditation process is voluntary. So why do people do it? Here's your next slide. Accreditation is voluntary. However, sometimes it becomes so important that it can be considered quasi-mandatory. For example, Joint Commission's deemed status. So what is deemed status big and fancy for? What that means is if your facility is accredited by Joint Commissions, then you already have under your belt what it takes to meet the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid standards to receive funding for Medicare and Medicaid. So what that means for your facility, if you've got Joint Commission's accreditation, you do not have to open up your facility for another review from CMS. Those requirements are folded in together, and CMS is going to grant your facility deemed status. What it does mean is if there's a problem, Joint Commissions can definitely come back in and certainly give you a review as CMS. But what it means is if you pass it and you do everything you're supposed to be doing, you get the one review. We're going to spend a lot of time on the focus of an accreditations assessment is on safe and effective processes and outcomes. You're going to become very familiar with that. It has ongoing requirements, and we're going to break that down too when we're specifically beginning our Joint Commissions discussion. Regulations. Regulations is just big and fancy for the interpretation of a law that is written by a responsible regulatory agency. For example, the Medicare Conditions of Participation. Medicare Conditions of Participation are regulations written by the CMS. So what is the Medicare COP? The Medicare COP is a handbook for facilities to understand what they need to do to be able to be compliant to receive Medicare and Medicaid funding. Whenever any of these interpretations have any kind of adjustment, that ends up in the Code of Federal Regulations, which is published, and folks can see what the additions or subtractions that were made to the Medicare COP. That's it. So that's a quick video of getting us started. What I want you to work on, I'm going to zip right on back. What I want you to work on is moving your way through the rest of the chapter. Make sure you read the information in the chapter. I'm hearing from some of you it doesn't seem like you're reading because your book's online. I need you to print these pages out and read them, because if you don't get this under your belt, you are not going to be successful moving forward. We talk about accreditation, licensure, and certification for the rest of the time that you're in the HIT program. We assume that after this module, we don't have to revisit what it is again. So you need to make sure you have this under your belt, and then you'll proceed after you watch this video to the next portion of the class. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.